licenses are the rules that apply to modifications to the source code of the distribution. Here's a diagram that looks at the differences in the open source licenses. And that last key aspect I was talking about, which is what happens when you modify the source code, is a key differentiating feature. If you look at the far left of this diagram, you'll see licenses that are the most permissive. And at the far right on the diagram, you'll find licenses that are the least permissive. And even within the range of permissiveness, the copyleft licenses, which I'll discuss in greater detail, you even have a range of just how weak or strong the copyleft attributes are. So permissive licenses or non-copyleft licenses essentially say, here's the software, do with it what you will. Make sure, however, that you continue to keep the copyright notice here and you pass through the license terms that we've distributed the software under. You can add additional terms, you can distribute it under a commercial arrangement. There aren't restrictions from that standpoint, and modifying the code is not problematic at all. Copyleft licenses are different in that they have additional restrictions related to the modification of source code. And it depends on the license that you're looking at. Under the Eclipse public license, for example, we're looking at derivative works, or whether or not the software is included in the same module. Under the Mozilla public license, it's modifications of source code related to at the file level. And so these licenses all indicate that if you modify the source code in some way, then you have to distribute the code under that same license. And that's the important distinction. Commercial licenses, which are again at the far right of that license spectrum that I highlighted, have additional restrictions. They'll have a restriction to use the software only on a particular computer. They may have a restriction against reverse engineering. They also have restrictions as to what product you may be able to distribute the code in. You'll see a lot more restrictions than you do at any other end of the spectrum, and certainly the very permissive licenses. So today we'll focus on the open source licenses, and that's the permissive and copyleft licenses. So open source license characteristics. I've got a plus and a minus on this slide, but really whether or not a characteristic is a plus or a positive or a negative depends on your individual circumstances and what your needs are. So for example, on the plus side of this, I've indicated that it's free. Now, some people would argue that there's still an investment of engineering resources and time to ramp up understanding the software, and that's true. But certainly if you're comparing it to proprietary software that's being sold at $50,000 a seat, the open source software is free. The availability of source code can be a positive to many, especially if you're using it internally and you develop an understanding of the source code. You may be able to fork the code slightly to address a particular need you have that the open source project does not address on its own. On the negative side, open source software is typically provided as is. You don't get any warranties, you don't get any representations, and in a typical supply management or buyer context, that can be very concerning. And there's no guaranteed level of support. The project is there. The project, you can submit typically bug patches back to the project, but if it's not something that the project is interested in, they have no obligation to apply your patch. Now, in the case of both of these things, you don't necessarily, if that is a concern to you, there are many, many member companies at Eclipse who build their products based on Eclipse software. And they build their business based on a model where they may provide the warranties and representations, and they may provide the support. So if that's a concern for you with respect to the software that you're interested in using, you can always mitigate that concern by sourcing the software that you need through a company that builds their business on providing those services. When you're looking at an open source license, it's really important to understand what your intended use is and what you need to do with that software. So for example, are you using it internally or externally? So are you using it for an internal use only, or are you distributing it as part of a product? Are you modifying the code, and if so, how? And then once you have a handle on those two things, you really need to understand the license itself and how that interplays with what you want to do. So if you're looking at an internal use situation, typically most open source licenses are very well suited to that. There are some licenses in particular where you do want to read them carefully and make sure, well, you should read all of them carefully. But one license in particular, the BSD template license, often gets modifications made to it that are added to the license. I'm not sure why it happens with that license, probably more than any other. We've seen restrictions on license terms so that you can't use it in the nuclear industry, for example. We have one fellow who said you can only use the software for good, not evil, and there have been other restrictions as well. You're looking at a distributed context and a permissive license, and again, those are the licenses at that far left-hand end of the spectrum, typically a BSD template style license or an MIT license, then you typically don't run into any difficulties. Those are very permissive licenses that allow you to do pretty much what you need to do. But if you're looking at distributed use and you're looking at a copyleft license, you need to be more careful. So questions as to whether or not you are going to modify the code and how you modify the code become that much more important. So doing your homework. What about risk? There has been a lot of discussion about risk and the risk for open source software, but that risk really applies to proprietary software as well. Risk is there by its very nature, and so what can we do about mitigating that risk? I should note there has been some concern raised about litigation by some and whether or not open source is going to be more likely to experience litigation. Those fears, while raised not particularly a couple of years ago, just haven't come to fruition. There's been a few cases, some in Germany, some in the United States, generally supportive of the open source license itself and enforceability, but it really hasn't dealt with some of the sticky issues like linking and the GNU public license, for example. So we continue to use it. We do look at ways to mitigate risk at Eclipse, and so I'll start to talk to you about